Tonight, a developing story that has the potential to fundamentally alter the trajectory of the American economy and reshape the global order as we know it. This is a story about raw power, calculated strategy, and a world teetering on the edge of a crisis that few saw coming, but everyone will feel. The Kremlin has drawn a line in the sand. Russia's President Vladimir Putin has categorically refused to supply crude oil to the United States, and the aftershocks of that decision are already reverberating through financial markets, diplomatic channels, and the corridors of power in Washington. What we are witnessing right now is not some routine disagreement between trading partners. This is not a bureaucratic squabble over tariffs or a temporary spat that will resolve itself after a few rounds of diplomatic phone calls. This is a seismic rupture in the global energy landscape, and the implications for ordinary Americans, for businesses, and for the very stability of the international economic system are staggering in their scope. To appreciate the full weight of what is unfolding, one must first understand a fundamental truth about the modern world. Oil is not simply another product that gets bought and sold on the open market. It is the invisible engine that drives virtually every facet of contemporary civilization. It propels the vehicles that move goods across the country. It heats millions of homes during the brutal winter months. It powers the industrial machinery that keeps factories humming and supply chains functioning. It is woven into the production of plastics, pharmaceuticals, fertilizers, and countless other materials that modern life depends upon. When a nation with the energy reserves of Russia, one of the largest petroleum producers on the face of the earth, slams the door shut on American buyers, the consequences are not theoretical. They are immediate, tangible, and deeply disruptive. The United States stands at the center of this storm for a very specific reason. America remains the single largest consumer of oil on the planet, importing millions of barrels of crude every single day to sustain its vast economic apparatus. That consumption is not a luxury, it is a structural necessity. Without a steady and reliable flow of energy, the gears of the American economy begin to grind, slow, and eventually seize. And that is precisely the vulnerability that this decision has exposed. On one hand, there is the direct economic threat. Fuel prices could surge with alarming speed, potentially overnight, sending gasoline and diesel costs spiraling upward in ways that would be felt at every level of society. Trucking companies, airlines, farmers, manufacturers, and small business owners would all face a sudden and punishing increase in the cost of doing business. Those costs would inevitably be passed along to consumers, compounding the financial pressure on households that are already grappling with elevated inflation and strained budgets. On the other hand, and perhaps even more consequentially, this refusal carries an unmistakable geopolitical message. Putin is leveraging energy as an instrument of statecraft, demonstrating to the world that control over natural resources translates directly into strategic influence. By withholding oil from the largest economy on Earth, the Kremlin is sending a signal not just to Washington, but to every capital around the globe. It is a declaration that Russia possesses the willingness and the capability to weaponize its energy exports in pursuit of its national interests, regardless of the pressure applied by Western sanctions or diplomatic isolation. This is not a crisis confined to distant boardrooms or abstract policy debates. The tremors of this decision will be felt in every American household, in every community, and across every sector of the economy. Financial markets are already reacting with visible anxiety, and political leaders in Washington are confronting a challenge that demands swift, coordinated, and strategic action. The interconnected nature of the global energy system means that no country, regardless of its size or economic power, exists in a vacuum. What happens in Moscow does not stay in Moscow. It cascades outward, touching lives, reshaping markets, and forcing governments to reckon with uncomfortable truths about dependency, vulnerability, and the fragile architecture of global trade. This is not merely a news story, it is a defining moment, a stark and urgent warning that the foundations of economic stability and geopolitical order are shifting beneath our feet, and the consequences for the United States may arrive faster and hit harder than anyone is prepared to admit. The scale of what is at stake here cannot be reduced to simple numbers on a screen or fluctuations in a stock ticker, though those numbers are alarming enough on their own. The United States consumes an extraordinary volume of crude oil every single day, and that consumption is not an indulgence or an excess. It is the fundamental infrastructure upon which the entire American way of life has been built. Every gallon of gasoline that moves a commuter to work, every barrel of diesel that powers a freight truck across the interstate, every unit of heating oil that keeps a family warm through a freezing January night represents a thread in the vast and intricate tapestry of the national economy. Pull enough of those threads at once, and the entire fabric begins to unravel. Now, consider the context in which this crisis is emerging. The global economy has not yet fully recovered from the devastation wrought by the pandemic. Supply chains that were shattered during lockdowns have been painstakingly reassembled, but they remain fragile and susceptible to disruption. Warehouses in key distribution hubs are operating with thinner inventories than they carried before the pandemic struck. Shipping networks are stretched, labor markets in critical logistics sectors are tight, and the margin for absorbing sudden shocks has narrowed to a razor's edge. Into this already precarious environment, Russia has introduced a disruption of enormous magnitude, and the system may simply lack the resilience to absorb it without significant damage. The mechanics of how this plays out are neither mysterious nor speculative. They follow a well-documented pattern that economists and energy analysts understand with painful clarity. When a major supplier withdraws from the market, the immediate effect is a spike in prices. Crude oil futures climb, and within days or even hours, those increases begin to cascade through the downstream economy. Gasoline prices at the pump rise sharply. Diesel costs escalate, driving up the expense of transporting goods by truck, rail, and ship. Heating oil becomes more expensive, squeezing households and businesses that depend on it for basic warmth. Jet fuel prices surge, pressuring airlines to raise fares or cut routes. And because energy is embedded in virtually every product and service in the modern economy, the inflationary pressure does not remain confined to fuel alone. It spreads outward like a shockwave, touching everything from the price of bread on a grocery store shelf to the cost of a medical procedure at a hospital. Beyond the initial price shock, the secondary effects are equally devastating and potentially longer lasting. Factories that rely on petroleum-based inputs or energy-intensive processes may be forced to scale back production or halt operations entirely. Small businesses operating on thin margins could find themselves unable to absorb the increased costs of fuel, shipping, and raw materials, pushing some toward closure and others toward painful decisions about staffing and wages. The agricultural sector, which depends heavily on diesel-powered equipment and petroleum-derived fertilizers, would face a particularly acute squeeze. Farmers already contending with volatile commodity prices and unpredictable weather patterns would now have to absorb dramatically higher input costs, costs that would ultimately be reflected in the price of food for every American consumer. And then there is the labor market, which sits at the intersection of all these pressures. When businesses face rising costs and shrinking margins, the most common response is to cut expenses, and payroll is almost always the largest single expense on any company's balance sheet. Layoffs, hiring freezes, reduced hours, and wage stagnation are the predictable consequences of a sustained energy shock. For working families already struggling to keep pace with the cost of living, the loss of income or the erosion of purchasing power could be catastrophic. The psychological toll should not be underestimated either. Consumer confidence, that fragile but essential ingredient in economic health, tends to plummet when people see gas prices climbing and hear warnings of further disruption on the horizon. When confidence falls, spending contracts. And when spending contracts, the economy slows, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of decline that can be extraordinarily difficult to reverse. What makes this particular moment so dangerous is the compounding nature of the risks involved. This is not a single isolated shock arriving in an otherwise stable environment. It is a major disruption landing on top of existing vulnerabilities, amplifying pressures that were already building and exposing structural weaknesses that policymakers have long been reluctant to confront. The interconnectedness of the modern global economy means that the pain will not be distributed evenly or contained neatly within borders. American manufacturers who depend on global supply chains will find those chains disrupted not only by their own rising energy costs, but by the cascading effects on suppliers, shippers, and trading partners around the world. Financial markets, which thrive on predictability and stability, will react to the uncertainty with volatility, eroding retirement savings and business investment at precisely the moment when both are most needed. But perhaps the most sobering dimension of this crisis is the question it forces upon the nation. How did we arrive at a point where a single decision by a foreign leader can exert this degree of influence over the daily lives of hundreds of millions of Americans? The answer lies in decades of energy policy choices, infrastructure investments, and geopolitical calculations that have left the United States more exposed than many assumed. The comfortable narrative of energy independence, so frequently invoked in political discourse, now confronts an uncomfortable reality. Independence is not merely a function of how much oil a nation produces within its own borders. It is a function of how global markets price that oil, how supply disruptions elsewhere affect domestic costs, and how interconnected the entire system truly is. Russia's refusal to sell is a mirror held up to those vulnerabilities, and the reflection is deeply unsettling for anyone willing to look at it honestly. The question now is not whether the impact will be felt, but how deeply it will cut and how long the wounds will take to heal. The critical question that analysts, diplomats, and policymakers are now grappling with is deceptively simple on its surface, but profoundly complex in its implications. Why now, and why direct this maneuver squarely at the United States? The answer, according to a growing consensus among geopolitical strategists and energy experts, centers on a single word that has defined great power competition for centuries: leverage. This is not a rash or impulsive act by the Kremlin. It is a calculated and deliberate exercise of strategic power, carefully timed to inflict maximum pressure at a moment when the United States is already navigating a turbulent landscape of domestic economic challenges and international uncertainty. Putin is not merely refusing to sell a commodity. He is deploying that commodity as a weapon, wielding energy reserves the way a military strategist might deploy battalions on a contested frontier. To understand why this strategy carries such potency, one must recognize that oil has never been merely an economic asset. Throughout the modern era, control over energy resources has served as one of the most reliable instruments of geopolitical influence available to any nation. Countries that possess abundant reserves have consistently used that advantage to shape alliances, extract concessions, reward cooperation, and punish defiance. Russia, sitting atop some of the most prolific oil and natural gas deposits on the planet, has long understood this dynamic and has historically demonstrated a willingness to use its energy exports as a lever in international affairs. What is different now is the directness and the audacity of the move. By singling out the United States, the world's preeminent economic and military power, Putin is making a statement that reverberates far beyond the bilateral relationship between Moscow and Washington. He is signaling to every nation watching that Russia remains a formidable player on the global stage, capable of imposing costs on even the most powerful adversary, and unwilling to bend under the weight of sanctions or diplomatic isolation. For the current administration in Washington, which has already faced significant scrutiny over its approach to foreign policy and international trade, this refusal represents a test of extraordinary magnitude. It exposes vulnerabilities that political opponents will be eager to exploit and forces a series of difficult choices that carry consequences no matter which path is chosen. If the administration responds with aggressive countermeasures, it risks further escalation in an already fraught relationship with Moscow and potentially destabilizing other diplomatic channels that depend on a minimum baseline of cooperation. If it adopts a more measured approach, it faces accusations of weakness at a moment when projecting strength is politically and strategically essential. Every option on the table comes with a price, and every decision will be dissected by allies, adversaries, and the American public alike. History offers sobering precedent for what can happen when energy becomes entangled with geopolitical confrontation. The oil embargo of the 1970s remains one of the most instructive and cautionary episodes in modern economic history. When oil-producing nations cut off supply to the United States and its allies, the consequences were swift and devastating. Prices did not simply rise, they exploded, quadrupling in a matter of months and sending the American economy into a tailspin of inflation, recession, and social upheaval. Gas lines stretched for blocks, industries ground to a halt, public confidence in government institutions eroded dramatically, reshaping political alignments and policy priorities for a generation. The scars of that crisis took years to heal and fundamentally altered the way the United States thought about energy security, foreign policy, and its own vulnerabilities in an interconnected world. The parallels to the current moment are striking and deeply concerning. While the United States today possesses a more diversified energy portfolio than it did 5 decades ago, including significant domestic shale oil production and a growing renewable energy sector, the fundamental vulnerability remains. The global oil market operates as a single interconnected system, and a major disruption anywhere in that system sends price signals and supply shocks rippling across every border. Domestic production, no matter how robust, does not insulate a nation from the pricing effects of a global supply contraction. And the renewable alternatives that represent the long-term future of energy are not yet deployed at a scale sufficient to serve as a near-term substitute for the sudden loss of a major petroleum source. The lessons of the 1970s are clear and unforgiving. When energy supply is weaponized, the damage extends far beyond the commodity itself, reaching into the very foundations of economic stability, political cohesion, and national confidence. So what recourse does the United States actually have in the face of this extraordinary challenge? On the surface, the menu of options appears reasonable and even reassuring. Diversify energy sources, accelerate domestic production, release barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, negotiate aggressively with alternative suppliers in the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. Each of these responses sounds logical in a briefing room or a policy paper, but the harsh reality is that none of them can be executed quickly enough, cleanly enough, or cheaply enough to neutralize the immediate damage that this crisis threatens to inflict. Consider the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, perhaps the most readily available tool in the government's emergency arsenal. It was created precisely for moments like this, a buffer against sudden supply disruptions. Yet it is a finite resource, and deploying it requires exquisite calibration. Release too much too quickly, and the safety net is depleted, leaving the country even more exposed if the standoff drags on for months. Release too little, and the gesture becomes symbolic rather than substantive, failing to arrest the upward spiral of prices or calm the anxiety coursing through financial markets. The politics surrounding such a decision are equally treacherous, with every barrel released becoming fodder for debate about whether the administration acted too aggressively or too cautiously. Turning to alternative international suppliers introduces its own labyrinth of complications. Every barrel sourced from a new partner comes with strings attached, whether in the form of higher prices, binding long-term commitments, geopolitical concessions, or the delicate recalibration of existing alliances. The Middle East, often cited as the natural alternative, carries its own constellation of diplomatic sensitivities and strategic entanglements. Latin American producers may lack the infrastructure or the spare capacity to fill the gap on the timeline required. And every negotiation conducted under duress weakens the bargaining position of the buyer, a reality that rivals and partners alike will be quick to exploit. Domestically, the expansion of shale oil production and the acceleration of renewable energy deployment represent the most promising long-term answers, but neither offers immediate relief. Shale wells require investment, permitting, labor, and time to bring online. Wind farms and solar installations cannot be conjured from nothing in a matter of weeks. The infrastructure gap between where the nation stands today and where it needs to be is measured not in months, but in years, and this crisis demands solutions that operate on a timeline of days and weeks. This is the fundamental tension that defines this moment. The United States possesses the resources, the ingenuity, and the economic depth to navigate this disruption. But the window for effective action is narrow, the margin for error is slim, and the consequences of miscalculation are severe. Every decision made in Washington from this point forward will be scrutinized not only by the American public, but by every government, every market, and every adversary watching from abroad. How the nation responds will shape not just the immediate economic trajectory, but the broader architecture of global power for years and potentially decades to come. This is not simply an energy crisis. It is a test of national resilience, strategic vision, and leadership under pressure. The world is watching, the clock is running, and the outcome of this confrontation will echo through the economy, through communities, and through the daily lives of every American long after the headlines have faded. This story is far from over, and the questions it raises demand answers that match the extraordinary gravity of the moment. Because the world is changing, and complacency is no longer an option.